Hello, hello. All right. How we doing, guys? We are live on multiple platforms. I'm using Restream tonight, so restream.io, and I'm trying to go live if everything is as it says right now. I am live on DLive, on YouTube, on Periscope, and Facebook. So everybody just give a thumbs up in the chat if audio is good right now before we dive in and get too crazy. What's up, Breathing Bear? How you doing, brother? Today, so welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos. And today I want to talk to you guys about the Hermetic Tradition. So we're going to go deep into an overview on Hermeticism, on the Hermetic Tradition, be getting into the sort of religious, philosophical presuppositions of this worldview, their belief systems, but to give a sort of historical analysis, how this stuff plays itself out, how it actually arrives in the European Renaissance in Florence, Italy, where it really takes root and alters really the course of European history, and especially of the 16th century. And so we're going to be getting into how the 16th century is the most magical of all centuries. And so for anybody that just tuned in, please hit the like button. We are, again, that's always helpful for the algorithm. So right now, as I mentioned, we are streaming on YouTube, on DLive, on Periscope, on Facebook. We got multiple streams going on at the same time here. So anyways, like I said, we're going to be getting into Hermeticism in a variety of different ways. So to begin, as I usually do, if some of you guys are new, well, welcome. If some of you guys have been watching for a while and appreciate what I'm trying to do, if you guys could potentially go to my website, davidpatrickcarey.com, churchoftheeternallogos.com, and in that top right-hand corner, there is a donate button. If you could potentially set something up for a monthly recurring payment, again, I would greatly appreciate that's sort of helping this operation get kick-started. Again, that's only if you are able and you appreciate the content coming out on this YouTube channel. So I would greatly appreciate that. So with that being said, let's get into, again, we got tons of books to reference today. We got so much material to cover. We're going to be here for a minute, that's for sure. I mean, like I said, I got a couple excerpts from the Corpus Hermeticum that I actually wanted to share with you guys and read. I got, again, I'm not going to be reading from this book, but this is The Wisdom of the Egyptians, because as some of you already know, our conversation today is certainly going to overlap with the Egyptian deity Thoth, the ibis-headed deity, the wisdom deity. And so that was going to tie into the sort of mythology of the Emerald Tablets. And so we got some of the Emerald Tablets here. We could potentially dive into some of that stuff. But we just got so much content today. Of course, Manly P. Hall's The Secret Teachings of All Ages, a cornerstone in the esoteric, in the alternative sort of spiritual worldview. Certainly the Freemason, Manly P. Hall is very popular. This is more of a scholastic book that I've actually done previous videos with that I highly recommend. This is by Goodrich Clark, and this is called The Western Esoteric Traditions, The Western Esoteric Traditions. And usually this actually has a cover on it. I don't usually keep covers on my books, but you'd see the Flammarion engraving on this. So that is the Western Esoteric Traditions. And again, for our conversation today, a big one will be Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition by Francis Yates. This is basically a staple regarding this topic. We're not going to be getting into this book. Somebody that's very popular in the Western esoteric field, main scholar in Walter Hanegraaff has actually been very critical of Frances Yates and her research and some of the things in this book. But generally speaking, this would be a good overview for a lot of the history that we're going to be getting into today. So I'm sure some of you guys are already familiar with that. And then this is actually a very interesting book by D.P. Walker called Spiritual and Demonic Magic from Ficino to Campanella. So this is really going to hit home in regards to sort of Renaissance magic, Reformation magic, because again, a lot of our conversation is going to be taking place in the second half of the 15th century and then running through then the 16th century, these 1500s, which again, I will highlight over and over again, is the most magical of, I would say, the centuries within European history, really, much more than the sort of, we get this faux understanding of the Middle Ages of these people filled with superstitions and whatnot, but actually they're very pietistic people. And I would say it's the 1500s, the 16th century, that is colored with a lot more magical and superstitious worldviews. So definitely going to be getting into that. Again, let me just make sure we are good. I'm using Restream tonight, so I'm potentially on multiple streams right now. Let me just make sure everything's going good. We got one person over at DLive. What's going on? And 8 people on Facebook. I don't know if Periscope is working or not. Somebody in the YouTube chat, could you let me know if we are live on Periscope? I would really appreciate that. So, to begin, to set the framework, the foundation for our conversation this evening, what is Hermeticism? So some of you guys are going to be familiar. I expected a lot of people are going to be bringing different amounts of knowledge to the topic tonight. This is a religious, a philosophical, a spiritual, a magical, esoteric tradition. Pano, what's going on, my brother? He threw in $2 and said, you're a wizard, David." I'm no wizard, but I do appreciate the $2, and shout out to Pano. Hope all is well in the Lafayette area, fellow Hoosier. So anyways, so what is Hermeticism? Well, it's a religious, a philosophical, a magical, esoteric tradition. And in regards to it being considered a sort of religious tradition, actually modern scholars have fairly agreed that it is. And in regards to it being a philosophical tradition, I think it's going to be quite evident to see the sort of Neoplatonic elements that are going to emerge in our conversation tonight in regards to emanationism, for example, regards to a dramatic emphasis on the one, on the monad. We're going to see it be very mentalistic, right? The first principle of Hermeticism. Again, we're going to be going into the Kabbalion. This is a very popular sort of New Age text that talks about these principles, is mentalism itself. And so all is mind. Mind is the source of all effect in the universe. And of course, that is going to be rooted then in this idea of the mind of all, the God of all, the monad. And it's going to take on a very mentalistic framework. In fact, even when we get into some of the readings in the Corpus Hermeticum, they'll even make reference to logos, not using it, of course, in an Orthodox Christian or any type of Christian framework based on the Gospel of John, but much more so in a Platonic understanding of logos, even an Aristotelian, more of an emphasis on speech and reason. And so we're going to be seeing that as we discuss the Corpus Hermeticum as well. And so I have a few different parts that I wanted to read from there. But this whole tradition, this whole Hermeticism, is based on what was believed to be, and by some still believed to be, but we're going to be getting into the nature of the debate regarding this, is a gentleman called Hermes Trismegistus. And he is believed to be the progenitor and the author of the Hermetic Corpus. Now, who is Hermes Trismegistus? Well, he's the thrice great one. And so we're going to be getting into his relationship, again, going back to Thoth, the wisdom deity of ancient Egypt, how that is tied to Hermes, the Greek deity, Mercury, the Roman deity. There's going to be a continual overlap. There's going to be movement through these various traditions and worldviews. And that's how this Hermeticism is really going to take a real prominent role as the sort of source, or it claims to be the sort of source of a Prisca Theologia. Again, we've talked about this in previous videos, but the Prisca Theologia is really the sort of ancient idea of modern-day perennialism, the idea that all religions lead you to the same mountaintop, right? We've talked about this in previous videos. And Prisca Theologia is the idea that there was a pristine, there was a primal, there was a central theological revelation that was given from God to man back in antiquity, and that all the different world religions have some notion or variation of this sort of this original doctrine, this original revelation from God. So this is called the Prisca Theologia, and this is going to greatly influence then what we would consider the Western esoteric traditions, the Renaissance, the Reformation. And really what Western esoteric traditions are, again, we try to talk about this in previous streams, is it's now its own academic field called the Western esoteric traditions, or WET, the acronym they usually use. But Western esoteric traditions are really all these magical traditions that get going after the Renaissance. And so the mid-15th century, the mid-1400s, is where this translation project of the Corpus Hermeticum really gets started, related to Marsilio Ficino, Cosmo De Medici. And we're going to slowly go through this more, but the beginning of the video is going to be, this is my introductory overview of what we're going to be getting into. So it's this Hermetic translation project that began in the mid-15th century that really sets the tone and tenor for all these magical traditions that emerge afterwards. And remember, 1517 is the Protestant Reformation. So as the Protestant Reformation occurs, we see new theologies, new understandings within Christianity emerge. We see Protestantism start to do away with the aesthetics, with the sort of mystical elements of Christianity in the name of, it being pagan, this or that. Of course, they had a very adversarial relationship with the Catholic Church at the time. So as that happens, mysticism itself, especially in Northern Europe, is going to be no longer expressant in Protestantism, generally speaking, and it's going to take more of a sort of underground role in what's called the Western esoteric traditions. And so alchemy, Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, what later becomes, the Hermetic Golden Dawn, like all these different secret societies, eventually with somebody like an Aleister Crowley. All this stuff really emerges from the fruits, from the foundational translation project that we'll get into in the mid-15th century. So this also, what's really interesting about Hermeticism, and this is another element that I want to tie into our conversation today, is that what we'll see with this worldview are a lot of crossovers in regards to a more scientific worldview. I have a handful of things that I want to mention regarding that, but it's very, very interesting in regards to man's relationship or dominion over nature, how man can extract secrets from nature through experimentation. This is going to lead to the whole alchemical project, which again, is, as we'll discuss, is way more than just turning lead into gold, this or that. It's a lot more than that. It actually has to do with the sort of spiritualizing of matter, and then these sort of experimental processes, the distillation, the fermentation, the amalgamation, all these alchemical terms are used then to understand that somehow matter and things physically present in the world reflect a spiritual reality. This is going to get to as above, so below. Again, we're going to move through this stuff more systematically here in a second. But alchemy itself, which leads into chemistry, man being the sort of sole source of dominion right now, or as Hermeticism talks about, the sort of brother of God left to finish creation. I think we see elements of that even within like the transhumanist projects, things like that. Say you wanted to turn lead into gold. Well, neutron bombardment, particle physics, this type of stuff, you could easily do that. So a lot of different things that we are going to be covering. And in fact, just in regards to these sort of scientific aspirations that I find really interesting regarding to the Hermetic worldview, because it's going to get into alchemy, it's going to get into conjuring spirits and putting daemons into statuary and stuff like that, is, even the ideas of the homunculus have a sort of scientific expression in modern day biology, genetics, stuff like that. But think of something like Aristotle's great chain of being and how then that gets sort of placed into motion with the Darwinian Wallace theory of evolution. And so it's very interesting then, because even Marcel Iliade, I'm sure some of you guys have read Iliade, he even talked about exactly what I'm saying, is that somehow the magical yearnings and intentions of the 16th century, of the 1500s, have been fully expressed, as he argued, in the 20th century. Now, I would say, I'd say probably the 21st century is expressing those even more of a greater, in a greater way. But this would all just insinuate that we need to move back towards Christianity and a traditional understanding of God. But I digress. You guys already know where I'm going. Again, if you guys can, please like the stream if you haven't. I know some people have just now joined, but going to be hitting on a lot of different topics. So, where do we begin? We can begin with history, or even the belief systems. I think we should start probably with the history, and then we'll get into the belief system. So, like I said, Hermeticism is derived from the Greek god Hermes. And Hermes was a deity related to boundaries, related to travelers, commerce, even thieves, if you will, athletes, shepherds, orators, communication. And so this communication is going to be very, very central to even the Hermetic theological worldview of man's mind and his ability to speak being reflections of how he's made like God. So, Joshua Limber says Hermeticism, am I right? Yeah. Thank you very much, brother, for throwing in $3. I greatly appreciate that. So, it's all related back to the Greek god Hermes, again, who has a Roman expression in the deity Mercury. And of course, from a theological perspective, it all is going to be related to the planet Mercury. Mercury is going to be the third planet from an astrological perspective. So the number 3, all this stuff is going to be related, at least within this astrological worldview, because Babylonian astrology, Persian astrology, is going to be a very central, again, force within the Hermetic worldview. So I want to say a little bit more about this boundary and communication, because Hermes as a deity, even as somebody depicted with winged sandals. And I believe it used to be like AT&T or somebody used to have like a sandal with wings on it. And that's really what they were getting at. Again, that was a reference back to Hermes himself as a deity of wisdom, as a deity of communication. And this is going to also be true when we get to Thoth, another wisdom deity. So we're going to see Hermes Trismegistus, who is believed to be a historical figure, okay, which I think most scholars do not believe actually existed anymore. But this was the central and force behind this whole thing, believed by many Christians, that Hermes Trismegistus was potentially a contemporary of Abraham, a contemporary of Moses. He was believed by many to be the greatest, the wisest man who ever existed. Again, by people more of the magical persuasion, believe that he's the one that received revelation from God himself. So we're going to see then magic typically has a very strong relationship to these wisdom deities. And the wisdom, I think, again, corresponds with this emphasis on the mind, on speech, on language. Because even as some of you guys know about more, more sort of fringe aspects of theories of magic, is that somebody like an Alan Moore, who is a very famous comic book writer, is a self-described magician, talks about, well, what is a spell? How do you cast a spell? But casting a spell is really spelling itself, and that language itself, the manipulation of words and meaning, which lead to the manipulation of perception, is what magic is about. And so I've talked to you guys before about even really interesting symbolic understandings of words. So where do you find, so money and water, I've mentioned this before in previous streams, but money is sort of man's version of water, right? So water is essential for life. You can't live without water. You can go more days without food than you can water. So man, in a magical, correspondential way, reflects the power of water in something he makes like money through a sort of linguistic process. This is an idea. Again, you guys don't have to prescribe to this, but where then do you find money? Where do you find water? You find water between two banks, river banks, the same place that you would find money. And therefore, when you try to turn something into cash, you're trying to liquefy it. You're trying to stay afloat. You're not trying to drown in debt. You're even, people say they're trying to make it rain. That when we really start to look at sort of the analogies we use in regards to money, they're all water metaphors. And this has to do with in the way that money occupies a central force within the people who speak that language. So it's very interesting when you begin to look at things in that perspective. But I think it's no surprise that we're going to be looking at language deities, communication deities, wisdom deities. So Hermes is depicted also as like the divine trickster. This is in Homer, his sort of homily that he or the hymn that he sings. I'm sorry, to Hermes depicts him as the great trickster. So we need to keep that in mind, and that he is the psychopomp. That's just a sort of fancy religious studies term for somebody who leads souls into the afterlife. So whether that be like an Anubis in the more Egyptian pantheon, but Thoth is also sort of depicted in that way. He's, again, the ibis-headed deity. But Hermes definitely is within the Greek pantheon. So he's a psychopomp. Again, he's the one who moves between boundaries. And so when we look at then the Hermetic tradition, conjuring deities, animating statues with daemons, what is this? This is a process of moving between boundaries, moving between worlds. Again, very interesting when you see it from that perspective. So his symbol is the caduceus, and so this is usually depicted as a staff with two serpents. And so obviously you would, those who are a little bit familiar with sort of Hindu mythology would, initially recognize, well, that looks like it has something to do with Kundalini energy, right? The sort of serpentine energetic force at the base of the spine that becomes activated and moves up the spine towards illumination. Sometimes the depictions of these stakes almost look like they're in copulation, so they are mating, if you will. But a lot of the times it just looks like they're wrapped around the staff. But that should not be confused with the rod of Asclepius, who was also actually tied to Hermes. But Asclepius is one of the students of Hermes in the Hermetic Corpus. There's a whole section to Asclepius. It's a dialogue. And Asclepius, the rod of Asclepius, is actually associated with the sort of medical field and healing. However, when you look at a lot of hospitals, a lot of medical centers, you'll see the caduceus. Technically, it should just be a rod with one snake. That is technically the rod of Asclepius. But, that's neither here nor there. But it is interesting. Next time you go to a hospital or you're looking at an ambulance, or look for the rod of Asclepius or the caduceus, a rod with either one snake or two serpentine snakes wrapped around it. So that, again, is interesting. And a common phrase to understand Hermes, we're still in the Greek god Hermes, is that he was the god of the road between the upper and the lower world. Again, right, he transcends boundaries. He's kind of in betwixt. He's in between. So we see that again there. Now, how does this connect then with the Egyptian deity Thoth? Well, Thoth is again the wisdom deity of the Egyptian pantheon, and he was associated with magic, with language, with alchemy, with science, with all these different things. So at Hermes Trismegistus, then, again, who is believed to be a historical figure that we do not actually believe to existed, but is going to be central for a lot of the people in the Renaissance, the Middle Ages, even early Christianity. Some of the people who were fooled by the Hermetic Corpus did believe that Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great one, actually was a historical figure. In the way he gets the last name Trismegistus, again, is actually a direct reference from scholars believed to be back to Thoth, and that Thoth had a title. I forget in what temple they found this in, but it said Thoth the Great, the Great, the Great. And so Thoth was the thrice great one, and that the people who actually wrote the Hermetic Corpus sometime between the 1st and 2nd century AD, as we will get to, how this was a revolutionary idea to a lot of the people who were reading this stuff, but that they called Hermes the thrice great one, again, in a way to demonstrate the sort of lineage from ancient Egyptian to then Greco-Roman to what they believe to be in the Renaissance, this continual lineage of the Prisca Theologia, of the original theology. Because again, to these people, Hermes Trismegistus was older than Moses. So if you're living in a Christian worldview, Christian paradigm, especially say in the Middle Ages of some sort, and you believe that this gentleman named Hermes Trismegistus was not only older than Moses, potentially a contemporary with Abraham, some even thought maybe older than Abraham. He was older than Pythagoras. He was older than Plato. He was older than the Greek philosophical tradition, and that he was the source of all real wisdom that exists. You would definitely be interested in some of the stuff he had to say. Now, a lot of this overlaps with the Christian worldview. A lot of it is directly in contradiction too. And so when we actually read some of this, you'll be able to see what exactly I'm talking about. But Hermes and Thoth, again, this Greek deity that I just talked to you about, was actually worshipped along with Thoth as the same deity throughout the Ptolemaic period in Egypt. So some of you who are a little bit more familiar with your Egyptian history, throughout the Ptolemaic period, this is why we have cities like Hermopolis. Hermopolis is the city of Hermes. So Hermes then is just the Greco term for Thoth. And so we need to keep that in mind as we move through this, is that Hermes and Thoth were worshipped as the same deity during the Ptolemaic period. And what does the Hermetic literature coming out of Egypt focus on? Well, it focuses on conjuring spirits. It focuses on animating statues and mixing alchemy with Greco-Babylonian astrology. And so keep in mind, because this, as we will read a little bit further, is that, within the Hermetic worldview, Hermes told or educated, I forget in what dialogue, it may have been the Poimandres, discussed how he told, I think it's in a dialogue, I think the Poimandres actually is a dialogue, that Zoroaster was the source of astrological knowledge. And that Zoroaster, again, we have to remember Zoroastrianism, this is the fire-worshipping tradition coming out of Persia, sometimes articulated as the very first monotheism, true monotheism. We see fire symbolism, even if we look at a Heraclitus talking about the Logos, right? We're talking about 500 BC or so, that he's already talking about, his Urshtab. This was between Anaximenes with air and Thales with water, and Heraclitus said fire. So I think there's an interesting connection, because a lot of these things, we're influencing each other. But for Hermes, he believes Zoroaster, this is what he educates in some of these texts, that Zoroaster is the source of sort of the astrological knowledge. And even within our Christian worldview, I think it is interesting to note that it's three magi, three Persians who follow the stars to come and give glorification to the incarnation of the Logos in Jesus Christ. So even within our own tradition, there is a reference to the sort of astrological lore or abilities or knowledge, I don't know how you want to frame that, within the Persians, within their tradition. So Hermes makes that explicit. Trismegistus, this is more mythologically, but it was believed that he was accredited with like thousands of different works within Egypt. We only know of 42. And in fact, you can look up Clement of Alexandria, who I did a video on last time, and his doctrine of the Logos. But Clement of Alexandria believed that there was only 42, and that's really kind of the number I think most scholars still agree, is that there's like 42 texts that are kind of related to Hermes within the Egyptian tradition. And this was believed to be, again, a number of completion, number 42. So that really ties that part together. Before I get into its reception or revival, sort of my favorite part, talking about the Renaissance, I want to mention what exactly was the worldview. What exactly are the belief systems of Hermeticism? And so let me talk about that real quick. So the first one that I want to get into is, again, we've already highlighted, is the Prisca Theologia. This is, again, the idea that there is one single true theology that exists, and it exists in all religions to one degree or another. As we'll see with some of the Renaissance people, they still identify themselves as Christians, Christianity being somehow the epitome of this true theology. But still, they were incorporating aspects of Jewish Kabbalah, of Sufism, Islamic mysticism, alchemy, paganism, stuff like that into it. So we definitely would reject a lot of that. But, Ficino comes to mind, Pico della Mirandola comes to mind. So they believe that there was this one true theology that existed, and it was given by God to man in antiquity. In order to demonstrate the truth of the Prisca Theologia doctrine, Christians appropriated the Hermetic teachings for their own purposes. By this account, Hermes Trismegistus was either a contemporary of Moses or the third in a line of men named Hermes, related to Enoch, Noah, and the Egyptian priest king who is known to us as Hermes Trismegistus. So that is the first thing that they believed was a Prisca Theologia, that there was a unifying single theology, and that themselves, so I'm talking about people who identified as Hermetic thinkers or part of Hermetic practice, again, because this is a ritual tradition of magic. So if they're using some of the technical aspects of the Hermetic Corpus that tells you how to do rituals, how to do incantations, how to do conjurations, they saw themselves as practicing this original wisdom. And again, I say this is the sort of beginning point of the concept of perennialism itself, which then is expansive within the Western mind. This is why you see much more perennialism, all religions lead to the same place, from Western people as opposed to Eastern people or non-Western people, generally speaking. Of course, now because of the Americanization of the globe, you see this rhetoric done by a lot of people all over the world as a way to really not offend anybody. Well, all religions have equal truth. Of course, we reject that here on this YouTube channel because the only true religion is Logos theology, is Christianity. But the other aspect that is very essential to keep in mind as we move through this is that within the Hermetic worldview, they believed in the law of correspondences. Again, this is a magical tradition. They believed in sympathetic magic. And so sympathetic magic believed in the microcosm and the macrocosm, that as above, so below, as within, so without. And so that leads to this idea that whatever happens at any level of reality happens at every other level of reality. That, again, everything corresponds. Everything is sympathetic to each other. And really, this highlights then why they believe they can do magic in the first place. How you do magic. Again, this relates to what I was talking about with words and language, the correspondential effects of things, and that man has the ability to create symbolic systems, to create ideas, to create these things, to create rituals that then affect the world on a multitude of scale, of a multitude of levels, physical, emotional, mental, spiritual. All these different emotions are affected whenever one is affected. This is essential to their worldview, and this is related then to the microcosm and the macrocosm. The idea that the microcosm, yourself, your individual self, is a reflection of the universe itself, right? So this leads to somebody like a Ficino having the quote, "Man is the measure of all things." Man is the measure of all things. Why? That makes sense totally in a Hermetic worldview where the actual microcosm of the entire universe is man himself. And I think it should be noted that in Hermeticism, they don't have a doctrine of the fall. So their anthropology is going to be very different than the beginning point within a Christian paradigm of an original sin, of man needing to repent from sort of fallen proclivities that he has. This is not going to be present in a Hermetic worldview, that man is the brother of God. In the Hermetic worldview, they believe that the universe was basically constructed to a 95% completion, and that God, the one, the all, the mind of everything, gave his androgynous creation. And this really is what they believe, that man was originally created androgynous, and that through his carnal appetite, he separated into male and female, but that his androgynous creation was left to complete the ontological project of being. Now, we obviously don't believe that, but I think, again, it should be noted and highlighted that this idea of even androgyny, created androgyny, man was originally androgynous. I think this leads, again, to presuppositions that even emerging within our contemporary society, related to transgenderism, related to concepts of gender, related to how, again, if people who aren't very perceptive of the things that they believe in, that it's very common for them to try to talk about androgyny as the goal. Androgyny is the goal, right? You don't want to be male or female because somehow those are unbalanced forces. Those are unbalanced forms of being, and that the ultimate balanced form of being is sort of this androgynous form of being. Now, from a Christian worldview, we would absolutely reject that because we see the distinction, the bifurcation of gender as male and female, as inhabiting two entirely different roles, and that the fulfillment of those two distinct roles is actually a better form of reflection of God's creation. So androgyny itself. So then when we look at look at fashion, look at some of the models put out, look at the feminization of men and then the sort of masculinization of women, and we see a sort of, I would say, again, related to this more magical underpinning, these presuppositions that underline it, moving towards androgyny. So I think that there's something interesting to keep in mind there, at least from my perspective. So as above, so below. So again, they believe in a correspondential and a sympathetic understanding of reality, cause and effect of that sort. So keep that in mind. That is a very big part. And then they have the 3 parts of wisdom. These are sort of the 3 modes of working in the world from the Hermetic worldview. The first one, of course, is alchemy. Alchemy. And so we want to say that, of course, I'm sure there were charlatans of the past who talked about changing, converting lead into gold, this or that. But this is not so much the purpose of alchemy within the Hermetic worldview. Alchemy is very clearly a form of physical experimentation under, again, they believe that everything is affected and liked and sympathetic to everything else. So matter is just correspondential to spiritual forces. And so partaking in the magnum opus, the great work, that's just Latin for the great work, and that's what alchemy was considered by Hermeticists. By partaking in the great work, what you're doing is trying to uncover the spiritual reality, usually about oneself, because you are a microcosm. So you want to study oneself to understand the universe, to understand God. So alchemy is it's more complex than I think a lot of people just tend to give lip service to it. I'm not advocating for alchemy. I'm not saying that. I'm saying what they were doing was more sophisticated than just thinking that they can heat up lead, they can distill it, they can fragment it, all these different things, and it turns into gold. No, the idea is that lead being such a sort of heavy, solid, basic material, that the transmutation process, the magnum opus of the alchemical distillation, is to emerge as the spiritual gold. That's what they believed, and then they would write this stuff down as sort of scientific chemical processes. But again, this was always typically understood in spiritual terms. And so if you look at like alchemical work, again, you're going to see androgyny come up over and over and over again. And so I just want to keep highlighting that I think there's these really interesting scientific connections to man essentially extracting the secrets of nature through experimentation like this. Again, most scientists don't think they're doing a spiritual work, but there's more connections than I think most people would actually give credit to what we're seeing in the 20th and the 21st century as the sort of fulfillment of a lot of the yearnings of the 16th century, the 1500s. And so we're going to be getting into people like Giordano Bruno. Who was that? Who was John Dee? John Dee, I think, is really a very, very interesting figure that if you don't know who he is, you definitely need to look into it. Because in one way or another, you've been exposed to him, whether you've known it or not, through movies, this or that. But anyways, back to what we're talking about. The three parts of Hermeticism, the first one being alchemy, the second one being astrology. Again, Hermes claims that Zoroaster discovered this part of the wisdom of the whole universe, and he taught astrology to man. So Zoroaster, Persian, so the whole idea is that somehow Persian astrology was absolutely a central tenet within this worldview, because the planets are way more than just planets. The movement of the planets, understanding the zodiac, understanding these things are how you're going to know the mind of God, the mind of the all, the mind of the universe. So astrology is essential. So we see alchemy doing something very here and now in the present, right in front of the Hermeticist or the alchemist. And then we see astrology sort of looking back up at the macrocosm to understand more about the microcosm. So we see it in two different ways, right? We see alchemy essentially starting with the micro, trying to learn about the macro, astrology starting with the macro to learn about the micro, because from their understanding with the zodiac is that through understanding the movements of the planetary systems, you're going to know what forces and effects that are occurring right here on the world. And then wisdom, generally speaking in the Hermetic tradition, is how then an individual goes about and interacts and deals with those forces and effects in the world. So this leads then to the third part or practice, central practice or wisdom of Hermeticism, and that is theurgy. And theurgy is really just another sort of theological religious studies term related to ritual magic, if you will. But it has a few different connotations. The way that the Hermeticists understand it, when they say theurgy, is they're trying to differentiate what they're doing in regards to ritual, correspondential, and sympathetic practices, what we would call ritual magic, from black magic. So they use the term theurgy to insinuate white magic. Somehow this is for the greater good. This isn't for sort of demonic purposes or trying to take people over or do harm to individuals. It's more about the purpose of this theurgic practice is to take one, and so you begin to resonate with higher forms of creation, ultimately to God himself, the all, the one, the monad, the mind, consciousness. I think, again, that same phrasing we see in the New Age, consciousness, that is a really a Hermetic yearning that's still just present underneath the surface, that's kind of always been there in sort of Western esoteric traditions, this or that. But theurgy then is just this practice of ritual, correspondential, sympathetic forms of magic, but believed to be in the purpose of white magic for the greater good, really for my own illumination. And this is why when I've talked about Promethean understandings of spirituality, Luciferian understandings of spirituality, illuministic forms of spirituality, that I've always included Hermeticism, because the whole point is for you to become illuminated. The whole point is for you to realize that you are God. You are what they call a mortal God. And you do that through your mind. So it's about what you understand and what you know. That is the immortal aspect of yourself. So it gets kind of complicated in regards to what the soul and the mind is, but this very radical emphasis on the mind is continually present within the spiritual worldview. And so, of course, if you had to guess, does Hermeticism believe in reincarnation or not? What would you suspect? I'll give you a second to chime into the chat there. Now, if you chose reincarnation, you would be right. And this is something that I've talked about multiple times about spiritual worldviews that begin to venerate creation itself. We see this in Hinduism. We see this in multiple forms of paganism. We see this in Hermeticism. I know Pythagoras had a very similar transmutation of souls, or transmigration of souls, I'm sorry, that reincarnation, I believe, is tied to a lot of these worldviews. And of course, Hermeticism also believed in reincarnation. In fact, in one of the texts, this is from The Way of Hermes. He says, "O son, how many bodies have we to pass through? How many bands of demons? Through how many series of repetitions and cycles of the stars before we hasten to the one alone?" And so this is even tied to some of the lore regarding Hermes and Thoth, is that for some people, they understood Hermes, again, I mentioned the city of Hermopolis and all this stuff, is that Hermes was just a more recent reincarnation of that same spirit that inhabited Thoth, which they believed to be an ancient Egyptian deity. So Hermeticism does believe in reincarnation, absolutely. In regards to good and evil, do they believe in good and evil? Yes. They believe in demons and angels and spirits. They believe that all good comes from God. It's a very Platonic understanding, again, because Hermeticism, like I said, takes a Neoplatonic framework. It's emanationist. The Logos, as we'll see in some of our readings, takes on the sort of first emanation of God, something like that. It's sort of demiurgic quality that you'd find in Plato and elsewhere. So, very interesting stuff there. Hold on, let me. So, some of the things that they considered evil in the Hermetic worldview, these are things that us as Christians would definitely get on board with. They considered adultery, murder, violence to one's father, sacrilege, ungodliness, strangling, and suicide of any form was considered to be a demonic action. So, did they believe in good and evil? Yes. It can get tricky. So it's not sort of a more rigid, objective morality like you'd see in Christianity. But they did definitely have concepts of good and evil, and they're not Manichaean. They are not Gnostic. They do not believe in sort of an eternal existence of evil. That is not the case. They do believe God, through his free will, created the world, the universe. So that is very interesting. That this again is present within the Corpus Hermeticum, that the sort of creation story is God, by an act of will, creates the primary matter that is used to constitute the cosmos itself. And that from primary matter, God separates the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water. Then God orders the elements into the seven heavens. This is, of course, the planets, the planetary bodies, which includes the moon and the sun, FYI. And then it's Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. And then they believe that the word, the logos, then leaps forth from the materializing four elements. So you see how then the word, the logos, is a created entity, so very different from our Christian worldview of an arche and ho logos. In the beginning was the logos was with God, and the logos is God. No, their logos is a sort of is an entity that leapt into matter through the materializing of the four elements. And it's related to this very Greek notion of nous, so very different than, again, our Orthodox. In Orthodoxy Christianity, we talk about the nous, we talk about it being the eyes of the soul. This is not the case within the Hermetic worldview. Very of a Greek notion. It really just has to do with mind, again, which is be consistent with their worldview. And in regards to the fall of man, I think this is very interesting, that man carefully observed the creation of nous and received from God man's authority over all creation. Man then rose up above the spheres, paths, in order to better view creation. He then showed the form of the all to nature. Nature fell in love with the all, and man, seeing his reflection in water, fell in love with nature and wished to dwell in it. Immediately, man became one with nature and became a slave to his limitations, such as sex and sleep. In this way, man became speechless, having lost, quote, the word, and became double, meaning mortal in body, yet immortal in spirit, and having authority over all creation, yet subject to destiny. So this would be their ultimate anthropology. So as I said, again, man was originally androgynous. As we see in most magical traditions, I mean, you look at a depiction of Baphomet. Baphomet is a goat-headed deity, seems to be has male genitalia and has female breasts. So androgyny is not rare within a magic worldview. So that really kind of sums up the beliefs that I wanted to highlight in regards to Hermeticism. Let me check the chat and see if we have any questions. Everything going good? Okay, just checking there. So looks like everything's good on YouTube. And we got a couple people over at D Live. Hello. Make sure to subscribe if you're over here on D Live. If you would like the alert streams, please. So anyways, let's see here. Get back to what we're discussing. So reputation and revival. So keep in mind, there's a couple things that I want to highlight. Again, we're talking about a tradition that really worships mind, worships the intellect, has a Neoplatonic understanding of God. And so there's a sort of Faustianism, I think, that can be run amok with a sort of Hermetic worldview in regards to, what do I mean by that, is a worship of man in his intellect. Because as we will read some from the Hermetic Corpus, this is a central emphasis of man's mind being not only the source of his immortality or an aspect of his immortality, but the mind and speech, lowercase l, logos for them, is how man demonstrates his divinity. And so Faustianism, when I've talked about it, there was a fact I wanted to do a stream on the archetype of the evil genius, because the evil genius archetype, I think, highlights this whole concept of man becoming God, again, in a worship of the intellect, in a worship of mind itself, that the Faustian yearnings, you could call it the Luciferian yearnings, because Lucifer would take on the same understanding of wanting to be God, wanting to become God, that I think it's very easy to get to that place, that sort of as I'm calling a sort of Faustianism within the Hermetic worldview. So during the Middle Ages, during the Renaissance, the Hermetica gained great prestige among the alchemists, among various magicians, and so it had a bit of a reputation. Now, mind you, within the early Christian context, they had destroyed many of these Hermetic texts. Although, if you get into one of the Nag Hammadi library, so within the Nag Hammadi, there actually are forms of Hermetic text in here. Not that I recommend it. I'm not advocating those texts. I'm just trying to give an analysis and an overview of that. The early Christians, they destroyed many of these texts as heretical, rightly so. And so there were bits and fragments everywhere. Many of them were then placed in caves within Syria, within Upper Egypt, around the Mediterranean. And so even within the Byzantine Empire, a lot of people were trying to hide some of this stuff, even the Neoplatonic elements. So Neoplatonism, you're looking at 3rd and 4th century, and that gets pretty much wiped out as well. At least their Neoplatonic schools get wiped out. So we have to keep all this in mind, that when our story is really going to get going, then we can begin with the Council of Florence. So the Council of Florence, most Orthodox Christians are going to be familiar with that. The Council of Florence happened between 1431 and 1449. Okay, so we're looking at, again, 15th century. And a gentleman was commissioned named Gemistus Pletho. Some of you may have heard of him. I would imagine many of you have not. But you can type him up. You can Google him, find his Wikipedia page. Gemistus Pletho was a Greek pagan. He was a Platonist. And he was commissioned by Cosmo De Medici. He actually came, and he was there at the Council of Florence, but he was commissioned to find a lot of these lost ancient texts within these caves in Syria, in Egypt, around the Mediterranean. And mind you, that at this time in the Renaissance, classicism was really taking root. And what I mean by classicism is this idea that somehow there's a nostalgia for paradise, that we're trying to, that the older something is, the better it is, because we're moving away from the pristine time, right? So if you are a Hermeticist, even for some of these Christians who believed in the Edenic garden, who we have been moving away from, or depending on how you understand it, moving back towards, that it makes a lot of sense then if you're a Hermeticist and you believe that God gave this direct, knowledge to Hermes back, this ancient deity. Again, Hermes Trismegistus, contemporary of Moses, believed by Lactantius, early Christian church father. Lactantius believed that Hermes Trismegistus was older than Moses. So we've talked about Philo of Alexandria. Philo of Alexandria believed that Moses educated Pythagoras and Plato and all these people. So there were a lot of theories in the ancient world going around about Moses being the source, the great teacher, Moses, Pythagoras. Orpheus was another one that was thrown into the debate. But for many, Hermes Trismegistus was believed to be the oldest and the most important. And so we have Gemistus Pletho then being commissioned by Cosmo de Medici, who's the Medicis. The Medicis, a major family that if you don't know, you need to be familiar with. And Cosmo, one of the many Medicis, during this period, so during the Council of Florence, you could say that he was arguably the wealthiest man in the world, maybe only rivaled by the Emperor of China. And so they had textiles and mercantile factories and stuff like that. Side note, this is also the time when usury really gets kind of going in the European context, is that the Medicis, again, being very wealthy, not wanting to pay their workers the amount that they should, they end up bringing in Jewish people to sell money at interest to some of the workers so they could pay them less. Not necessarily a good thing. So the Medicis aren't necessarily the greatest moral people in the world. But anyways, Cosmo de Medici, he hired Gemistus Pletho to find more and more of these texts. And so he had found the Enneads of Plotinus. He had found the Timaeus of Plato. I believe they had the Republic. And so they brought all these things back. This is now we're after the Council of Florence. Kept bringing all these works back of Plato back to Florence to be translated by a gentleman named Marsilio Ficino. Marsilio Ficino was a medical doctor. He's a very learned man. Clearly, if he's being hired to translate Plato, they haven't had Plato for 1,000 years. Plato's been lost. This is one of the reasons why scholasticism took up Aristotle so much, is because they had Aristotle's works. Plato had been lost. And so Ficino was then on a rapid translation project to get as much of Plato done as possible. And then here comes some works of what we would call the Hermetic Corpus. I think there was 8 works, 14 total, 8 of which Ficino, I believe, got done during this period. But then all of a sudden the Hermetic Corpus arrives, and Cosmo de Medici tells him to stop translating Plato, of which is probably considered one of the most important works at the Western tradition at the point, to translate the Corpus Hermeticum immediately because he wanted to read it before he died. And why was that so important? Is because, again, he believed this to be the oldest wisdom of mankind. These works, this Corpus Hermeticum, these works who he believed to be by Hermes Trismegistus. So this translation project begins at around 1460. Okay, so again, Council of Florence, we're looking at 1431 to 1449. We're looking at the beginning of the Hermetic translation project at 1460. And so it's there that that Ficino gets going. He gets a lot of this stuff translated, and Ficino himself becomes very prominent magician. I mean, I've spoke about him and his very famous student Giovanni Pica della Mirandola. Both very, very learned men. Marsilio Ficino was big on sort of the Orphic hymns, ritual magic, Neoplatonism. Again, he was still considered, or even considered himself, a good Catholic in good standing, but very eclectic in his sort of perennial grouping of all these different spiritual traditions together in the same place, okay? So they eventually get this stuff translated. Again, Marsilio Ficino's then doing all this magic. He has a student named Giovanni Pica della Mirandola, who, again, is very learned. He's a very young man, and he had been working on looking at what he called the Christian Kabbalah. So Kabbalah, Kabbalism, this comes out of the Jewish tradition. I'm sure most of you guys are already familiar. And so out of the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, he wanted to Christianize it because he believed it was fully expressed within the Christian tradition. This was what he did. He had a very famous book that he wrote. I think it's called 1,000 Theses. Maybe it's 100 Theses. I'm not positive, but very, very learned young man. I mean, in his 20s, he was, nobody would even debate him. He was a very sharp guy. According to some scholars, he was killed. I think he was like 31 years old or so, 32, 33. He was killed because he had a homosexual relationship with another man and was caught in the act, and they killed him. So he had a bit of a contentious ending to his life. But that was Giovanni Pica della Mirandola. But they had a very important impact on development, again, of what we call Western esoteric traditions. The whole magical tradition that emerges is from this translation project. So this leads to basically all these different historical figures being greatly influenced. I think of the Dominican friar Giordano Bruno. Some of you guys have probably heard of Giordano Bruno. He is famous for being burned at the stake. Some of you guys probably are aware. For believing that all the stars are suns. All the stars are suns. And so this was contrary to Aristotle. And because it was contrary to Aristotle, he refused to rescind what he thought. He believed that all stars were burning suns, and therefore that the universe was infinite. The universe was infinite. And because of that, he actually ended up fleeing, and then he came back to Italy after a while. Then he was betrayed by one of his friends and was burned at the stake. That was Giordano Bruno. And another figure like John Dee. Now, John Dee, again, very, very greatly influenced by the Hermetic translation. And so John Dee, I don't know if you guys are aware, but I think everybody should be aware that he is considered arguably to be one of the greatest magicians of all time. He has taken a sort of archetypal status in a lot of art, a lot of movies, comic books, all this type of stuff, is that whether you're aware of it or not, a lot of times they're actually depicting John Dee. And who John Dee was is the famous scientist, magician, international spy for Queen Elizabeth and for her British Elizabethan Empire. And so very, very fascinating, his life. Some of you may know that he was even considered to have the largest library in England. He was considered to be one of the learnedest man in Europe. He created the navigational devices for Sir Francis Drake when he sailed around, I think it was the Horn of Africa, right? South Africa, and also around California. Could be wrong there. But John Dee created his navigational device. He was an inventor. Again, this guy was extremely intelligent. He was famous for having the greatest horoscope. He could cast the best horoscope in all of Europe. So kings and queens and royalty all across Europe would pay for him to come cast horoscopes. And this is really how he also became a sort of international spy for Queen Elizabeth, is that he did a lot of traveling around Europe, and he would take notes and send sort of esoteric things back to her. But the most interesting thing is his goings-on with a gentleman named Edward Kelly. Some of you, again, may already be familiar, but there's a guy named Edward Kelly who came to John Dee. So legend begins is that John Dee was at his home doing his studies. Again, he has the largest library in all of England, and he hears this great noise in the garden. He goes out there, and what does he find? But a great black stone, what he called the shoe stone, more mythologically referred to as the philosopher's stone, if you will. But this shoe stone, he believed that he could look into it and communicate with the spirit world. Eventually, he meets up with this guy named Edward Kelly. And Edward Kelly was a bit of a charlatan. He didn't have any ears. So during this time period, it was fairly common for your ears to be cut off if you were a charlatan, if you were a con man. So then when people saw you in the future, they would know, well, I better keep my wallet in my pocket, especially if you got some grand idea and scheme to make money. So he had no ears. He came to John Dee, and they began this whole project where Edward Kelly could go into these sort of trance states. He would be able to convey what was being told to him through the shoe stone, and John Dee would then write this stuff down. This is also where the language called the Enochian language. The Enochian language, this was invented by John Dee. So if you look at like the Enochian star, all this stuff, this is all John Dee, and it's believed to be the language of the angels, right? Related back to Enoch, all this stuff. So they have this whole thing where they ended up traveling to Bohemia. They ended up traveling to King Rudolph II and his court, I believe, or maybe it was Rudolph I. I think it was Rudolph I, actually. But they end up traveling to Bohemia. Eventually, they claim that they'll be able to make lead and turn into gold. They're unable to do that. John Dee is forced to eventually leave. He's able to leave, go back to England. Edward Kelly's forced to stay, and he ends up dying because he slides off from one of the ceiling tiles, from the roof tiles, trying to escape from the palace because the King Rudolph wasn't going to let him leave until he got his gold. And so he basically became a prisoner. But it's very, very interesting. In fact, there's because John Dee was English, he wrote all this stuff in English. And so you can get the diary of John Dee. This is something that I have yet to do, that I want to do. In fact, I think it would be a great live stream series to just read the diary of John Dee, because it is his perspective during these happenings. So Edward Kelly did not read his diary. I don't know, he maybe probably knew, maybe he had a diary, but the diary of John Dee still exists from these sort of magical enterprise that occurred in the 16th century, in the 1500s. And so, like I said, John Dee, this is not a dumb guy. He's extremely, extremely smart, knows all these different languages, mathematics, extremely learned. He's an inventor. But all this stuff occurs in the 16th century. And one of the interesting things that Edward Kelly does is he convinced, again, because John Dee, with the Enochian language, with all this stuff. So this is how strange it was, is that Edward Kelly, from my understanding, he would, John Dee would like write this stuff down backwards somehow. Is that when Edward Kelly would go into these trance states, the way that they were retrieving information was backwards sometime, and then John Dee would have to go and then re-invert it. And when he would do that, he would find whole messages, whole succinct messages. This is what then led him to be more and more certain of what was going on in his opinion. So this happens again for well over a year, multiple years, and they're not getting exactly where they want to go. John Dee is becoming frustrated, and Edward Kelly convinces him that they needed to sleep with each other's wives. Now, John Dee, very learned, very wealthy, very educated, very famous man, was married to a much younger woman, Anne Dee. And of course, Edward Kelly wants to sleep with the old man's hot wife. And so they do that, and that basically ended things, because afterwards, John Dee didn't get what he wanted, and this is really where the whole partnership ends. And then Edward Kelly eventually falls to his death. So, interesting stuff. But John Dee, I mean, very, very fascinating figure. If you don't know who John Dee is, I recommend you guys looking into him. So, again, I'm going to name some figures throughout the 16th century. Johannes Roiklyn, another gentleman very interested in Kabbalah, in Hebrew, and all these different things. He was a translator. I mean, a very prominent, important individual. He's interested in alchemy, all this stuff. We get Johannes Roiklyn, Johann Trithemius, Michael Myers. Have you ever heard of Michael Myers? And I'm not talking about the Michael Myers, the horror movie. I'm talking about Michael Myers, the alchemical engraver. The magician Michael Myers. Henry Cornelius Agrippa, this was a Protestant who was very much into the magical, the alchemical stuff of this sort. Again, remember, 1517, 16th century is the Protestant Reformation, where we're really going to begin to see a split in Northern and Southern Europe. Paracelsus, I did a whole video on, another very interesting figure. Paracelsus is considered to be the originator of pills. Right? He came up with the idea of extracting some sort of essence, some sort of thing that you want from an herb, instead of just eating the whole herb. Again, you can see how this is tied to alchemy, the distillation process. He would distill herbs, extract the things that he wanted, and then he would make highly concentrated potions of whatever he wanted, ointments, this or that. He also created what we would consider capsules, modern day pills. This was Paracelsus, another figure greatly interested in alchemy, greatly influenced by Marsilio Ficino, greatly influenced by the Hermetic tradition. Jacoberma, looks like Jacob Boehme, so it's Boehme, but from all the Germans I've heard say his name, there's an umlaut over the O, and it's Jacoberma, is from my understanding. But Jacoberma is another person greatly influenced within the 16th century with all this stuff. So lots of goings on, very important individuals. That is just a fascinating period to study. The 16th century in Europe is a very, very fascinating period. There's so much going on that this really highlights our discussion. And then this whole Hermetic thing, this whole worldview that Hermes Trismegistus, this ancient man that is the source of all wisdom, the Prisca Theologia, it falls apart due to a gentleman named Isaac Casaubon. Isaac Casaubon in 1614 demonstrates, he's a philologist, and he demonstrates that the Greek that's used in the Hermetic Corpus is not ancient at all, and that the terminology that they're using at the earliest has to be 1st to 2nd century AD. Therefore, Christianity is older than Hermeticism. And you have to think about how radical this would be to somebody's worldview. Imagine somebody that you thought lived long, long ago. So let's just say, William Shakespeare, to find out that William Shakespeare, he actually lived in the early 20th century. You know, it's like, what? That would totally, to wrap your mind around that when you thought of where he existed in time, or think of George Washington, you know, that actually he was alive in the 20th century, you know, that it would totally warp the way in which you understood history. And that's exactly what happened, and that's why then people just started to give up on this whole magical Hermetic enterprise of the 16th century as they moved into the 17th century and the 1600s. Of course, some people were still alchemists. Some people were still prominent within this stuff. This stuff never fully dies, but it doesn't recapture that same life that it had in the 16th century. And this is because Isaac Casaubon proves philologically that there's no way this stuff is ancient. There's no way this goes back to antiquity, at least ancient Egypt, this or that clearly the terms that are being used, this is 1st to 2nd century Greeks living within the Roman Empire, basically, who are then grabbing from different mythological sources, grabbing from Egyptian mythology, grabbing from Greek and Roman mythology, taking Christian elements, Platonic elements of logos, all this stuff, and blending them all together. So that really puts a damper on things and greatly affects how Hermeticism is then received and moves on into the future. So wanted to highlight that. Let's see what else. So the Hermetic Corpus, we're going to read a little bit of the Hermetic Corpus real quick. Discusses the divine, discusses the cosmos, mind, man, nature, focuses on the oneness of God, the urge of purification of one's soul, the defense of paganism, and the divinity of man. This is what we're going to see over and over and over again. And the first thing that I wanted to read was what's called the Sacred Sermon. And the things that I'm choosing to read, I'm just choosing them because I think that they'll be helpful in sort of providing a understanding of the sort of Hermetic paradigm, the Hermetic worldview. So this is called the Sacred Sermon. It's only like 2 pages, so it's kind of short. But it reads, well, first I'll give you the quick little preface intro. It says, this brief text recounts the creation and nature of the world in terms much like those of the Poimandres. This is another Hermetic text. The major theme is the renewal of all things in a cyclical universe. Cyclical universe. Again, this is in opposition to our Christian worldview, which believes in a universe that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So that's been highlighted before. I just wanted to say that again. Anyways, it reads, the glory of all things is God, Godhead and godly nature. The source of the things that are is God, who is both mind and nature. Ye, matter, the wisdom that reveals all things. Source too is the Godhead. Yeah, nature, energy, necessity, and end, and making new again. Darkness that knew no bounds, as in the abyss, and water too, and subtle breath intelligent. These were by power of God in chaos. Then holy light arose, and there collected neath dry space from the moist essence elements, and all the gods do separate things out from fecund nature. All things being undefined and yet unwrought, the light things were assigned unto the height. The heavy ones had their foundations laid down underneath the moist part of dry space. The universal things being bounded off by fire and hanged in breath to keep them up. And heaven was seen in 7 cycles. Its gods were visible in the forms of stars with all their signs, while nature had her members made articulate together with the gods in her. And heavens
periphery revolved in cyclical course, borne on by the breath of God. And every god by his own proper power brought forth what was appointed to him. Thus there arose four-footed beasts, and creeping things, and those that in the water dwell, and things with wings, and everything that that beareth seed, and grass, and shoot of every flower, all having in themselves seed of again becoming. And they selected out of the births of men for gnosis of the works of God, and attestation of the energy of nature, the multitude of men for lordship over all beneath the heaven, and gnosis of its blessings, that they might increase in increasing, and multiply in multitude, and every soul enfleshed by revolution of the cyclic gods, for observation of the marvels of heaven and heaven's gods' revolution, and of the works of God and every energy of nature, for tokens of its blessings, for gnosis of the power of God, that they might know the fates that follow good and evil deeds, and learn the cunning work of all good arts. Thus there begins their living and their growing wise, according to the fate appointed by the revolution of the cyclic gods, and their decreasing for this end. And there shall be memorials mighty of their handiwork upon the earth, leaving dim trace behind when cycles renewed. For every birth of flesh and soul, and of the fruit of seed, and every handiwork, though it decay, shall of necessity renew itself, both by the renovation of the gods and by the turning round of nature's rhythmic wheel. Whereas the Godhead is nature's, even making new again the cosmic mixture, nature herself is also co-established in the Godhead. So we see the cyclical understanding, which was going to be very common, right? That's very consistent with a sort of Greco worldview, Aristotle, Plato, all this stuff. All that stuff is really good. So now we're going to go dive into the About the Common Mind section. And this is a much longer section. And the reason I picked it is because it's really going to highlight the sort of mentalistic phenomenon, the really mentalistic focus of Hermeticism itself. So here, this is going to be a few pages long, but you're going to hear things, and when it reads logos, I'm going to highlight that. Of course, it's not our logos, but it's going to be very interesting to see this emphasis on mind and hear things that maybe even sound Christian at times. Of course, they're not. They're not in a Christian paradigm, but bear with me. Here we go. So it says the common mind. This is about the common mind. This is a chapter within the Corpus Hermeticum. Discussed in this dialogue is the same mind which appears as a divine power in other parts of the Hermetic literature. Okay, so this is the divine mind. This is the all. This is what Hermeticism understands as God. And at points, this is a dialogue. So I will highlight Hermes or Tat. Tat is who he's speaking to. So Hermes, meaning Hermes is speaking. Hermes, the mind, O Tat, is of God's very essence. If such a thing as essence of God be there, and what that is, it only knows precisely. The mind, then, is not separated off from God's essentiality, but is united to it as light to sun. So right now we're seeing essentialist claims being made about God, that God is mind at his essence. This mind in men is God, and for this cause some of mankind are gods, and their humanity is nigh unto divinity. For the good Damon said, quote, gods are immortal men, and men are mortal gods, unquote. But in rational lives, mind is their nature. For where is soul, there too is mind. Just as where life, there is also soul. But in irrational lives, their soul is life devoid of mind. For mind is the inner worker of the souls of men for good. He works on them for their own good. In lives irrational, he doth cooperate with each own's nature, but the soul of men he encountereth them. For every soul, when it becomes embodied, is instantly depraved by pleasure and by pain. For in a compound body, just like juices, pain and pleasure see thee, and into them the soul, on entering in, it's plunged. O'er what's over souls the mind doth then preside to these, it showeth its own light by acting counter to the possessions, just as a good physician doth upon the body possessed by sickness, pain inflict, burning or lancing it for the sake of health. In just the self same way the mind inflicteth pain on the soul to rescue it from pleasure, whence comes its very ill. So we see a dichotomy between mind and matter. Again, very Platonic, that somehow matter, again, within their cosmogonic worldview, is the fall of man, is that we're even encased within a body, is the problem. So we see this dichotomy, this dialectic between mind and body being bad, and it leads us to pleasure. The great ill of the soul is godlessness. Then followeth fancy for all evil things and nothing good. So then, mind countering it doth work good on the soul, as the physician health upon the body. But whatsoever human souls have not the mind as pilot, they share in the same fate as souls of lives irrational. For mind becomes co-worker with them, giving full play to the desires towards which such souls are born. Desires that are from the rush of lust strain after the irrational, so that such human souls, just like irrational animals, cease not irrationality to rage and lust, nor are they ever satiate of ills. For passions and irrational desires are ills exceeding great, and over these God hath set up the mind to play the part of judge and executioner. Tat, this is who he's speaking to. He responds by saying, in that case, Father mine, the teaching, logos, lowercase l, as to fate, which previously thou didst explain to me, risks to be overset. For that if it be absolutely fated for a man to fornicate, or commit sacrilege, or do some other evil deed, why is he punished, when he hath done the deed from fate's necessity? Hermes responds, all works, my son, are fates, and without fate not of things corporeal, or either good or ill, can come to pass. But if it is fated, too, that he who doeth ill shall suffer, and for this causeth he doth do it, that he may suffer what he suffereth, because he did it. But for the moment, let be the teachings as to vice and fate, for we have spoken of these things in other of our sermons, but now our teaching, logos capital L or lowercase l, is about the mind, what mind can do, and how it is so different, and men being such and such, and in irrational lives so changed, and then again that in irrational lives it is not a beneficial nature, while that in men it quencheth out the wrath and lustful elements. Of, O men, again, we must class some as led by reason and others as unreasoning. But all men are subject to fate and genesis and change, for these are the beginning and the end of fate. And though all men do suffer fated things, those led by reason, those whom we said mind doth guide, do not endure, like suffering with the rest. But since they've freed themselves from viciousness, not being bad, they do not suffer bad. And Tot responds, how meanest thou again, my father? Is not the fornicator bad, the murderer bad, and so with all the rest? Hermes responds, I meant not that, but that the mind-led man, my son, though not a fornicator, will suffer just as though he had committed fornication, and though he be no murderer, as though he had committed murder. The quality of change he can no more escape than that of genesis, but it is possible for one hath the mind to free himself from vice. Wherefore I've ever heard my son, good Damon, also say, and had he set it down in written words, he would have greatly helped the race of men. And he alone, my son, doth truly as the firstborn God, gazing on all things, give voice to words, logoi, divine. Yeah, once I heard him say, quote, all things are one, And most of all, the bodies which the mind alone perceives, our life is owing to God's energy and power and aeon. His mind is good, so is his soul as well. And this being so intelligible, things know not of separation. So then mind, being ruler of all things and being soul of God, can do whatever it wills. So do thou understand and carry back the word, logos, unto the question thou didst ask before. I mean about mind's fate. For if thou dost with accuracy, son, eliminate all captious arguments, logoi, thou wilt discover that of very truth the mind, the soul of God, doth rule over all, over fate and law and all things else, and nothing is impossible to it, neither over fate to set a human soul, nor under fate to set a soul neglectful of what comes to pass. Let this so far suffice the good daemon's most good words. Tat responds, yeah, words divinely spoken, father mine, truly and helpful, but further still explain me this. Thou saidst that mind in lives irrational worked in them as their nature, co-working with their impulses. But impulses of lives irrational, as I do think, are passions. Now if the mind co-worketh with these impulses, and if the impulses of lives irrational be passions, then is mind also passion, taking its color from the passions. Hermes responds, well put, my son. Thou questionest right nobly, and is just that I as well should answer nobly. All things incorporeal wherein a body are subject unto passion, and in the proper sense they are themselves all passions. For everything that moves itself is incorporeal, while everything that's moved is body. Incorporeals are further moved by mind and movements, i.e. movement is passion. Both, then, are subject unto passion, both mover and the moved, the former being ruler and the latter ruled. But when a man hath freed himself from body, then is he also freed from passion. But more precisely, son, not is impassible, but all are passible. Yet passion differeth from passibility, for that the one is active while the other is passive. Incorporeals move, moreover, act upon themselves, for either they are motionless or they are moved. But whichsoever it be, it's passion. But bodies are invariably acted on, and therefore they are passible. Do not then let terms trouble thee. Action and passion are both the self-same thing. To use the fairer sounding term, however, does no harm. Tat responds, most clearly hast thou, father mine, set forth the teaching, logos. Hermes responds, consider this as well, my son, that these two things God hath bestowed on man beyond all mortal lives, both mind and speech, logos, equal to immortality. He hath the mind for knowing God, and uttered speech, logos, for eulogy of him. And if one useth these for what he ought, he'll differ not a whit from the immortals. Nay, rather on departing from the body, he will be guided by the twain unto the chorus of gods, the blessed ones. Tat responds, why, father mine, do not the other lives make use of speech, logos? Hermes says, nay, son, but only use of voice. Speech is far different from voice, for speech is general among all men, while voice doth differ in each class of living thing. Tat says, but with men also, father mine, according to each race, speech differs. Hermes says, yeah, son, but man is one, so also speech is one, and is interpreted, and it is founded the same in Egypt, and in Persia, and in Greece. Thou seemest, son, to be the ignorance of reason, logos, worth and greatness, for that of the blessed God, good Damon, hath declared, soul's in the body, mind in soul, but reason, logos, is in mind, and mind in God, and God is father of all these. The reason, then, is the mind's image, the mind God's image, while body is the image of the form the image of the soul. Again, you're seeing Platonic forms, strong Platonism here. So, yeah. And God surroundeth all and permeateth all, while mind surroundeth soul, soul air, and air matter. Necessity and providence and nature are instruments of cosmos and of matter's ordering, while the intelligible things each is essence, and sameness in their essence. But of the bodies of the cosmos each is many, for though possessing sameness, these composed bodies, though they do change from one into another themselves, do nathless keep the incorruption of their sameness. And this goes on, but I'm going to cut it off there. But anyway, so we see in the theology of Hermeticism, we see a mentalism, everything is mind. We see an immense emphasis on man trying to become God. We see Platonic dichotomies between incorporeal forms and material forms. Again, the forms being rooted, obviously, in the divine forms within the Logos. Demiurgic, though, because we see an emanationist understanding, again, with Neoplatonic elements coming in with the Hermetic Corpus. So a lot of interesting things going on there. Hope everyone's still riding along with me here. Let me check the chat and see what's going on. Anyone know the channel name? Oh, D Live. Yeah, here it is. We got two guys over on D Live hanging with us. Again, anybody over here on YouTube, please go over to the D Live. The D Live channel is The Eternal Logos, _eternal_logos. I may have to change it. D Live, you have to come up with, you can't have spaces in your name. So I may just change it to Eternal Logos or The Eternal Logos, all one word, something like that. But yeah, go over there and subscribe. Last thing that I wanted to do, guys, was go over the Kabbalion book written in 1908 by the Three Initiates, an anonymous book, and I wanted to go over the 7 Hermetic principles that, again, so you can watch out for these within New Age, sort of spiritual, not religious worldviews. And so the first principle, again, this all comes from a very popular book. I have a copy. I don't know where it is. I have these 2 big plastic tubs from when I moved back from California. They're filled with books. One is all East Asian stuff. The other one is all magic and psychedelics and that type of stuff. And then most of this stuff is all my Christian theology and philosophy stuff. But I did not get the Kabbalion out, but I have it. It's a very popular book. Again, it was written in 1908 by a pseudonym of the Three Initiates, claiming to be teaching the sort of essence of the Hermes Trismegistus doctrine as the truth of the universe, and that there's these 7 universal principles that everybody needs to know. And so the first one is the principle of mentalism, embodies the idea that, quote, all is mind. Everything that happens has to be a result of a mental state which precedes it. For everything to exist, thoughts had to form first, which then form physical reality or manifestation. And so one of the quotes is, "Your thoughts are seeds. Plant positive seeds in your mind garden." And so we can't help but notice the sort of similarities this might run into with, sort of New Age books like The Secret, The Law of Attraction, Think Rich. So all this type of stuff that somehow you have to think the world into existence. You have to think positively. You have to think in certain ways, and that this is going to lead, because one of these principles is vibration, to a vibratory manifestation that again emanates out into the world, and then, like, again, the law of correspondence, like attracts like, and then you begin to acquire those things. So the first principle of the Hermetic 7 principles is mentalism. And then number 2 is the principle of correspondence, of course, right? So the principle of correspondence, as above, so below, as within, so without. The principle of correspondence expresses the idea that there is always a correspondence between the laws of phenomenon of various planes of being and life. So there's the great physical plane, there's the great mental plane, and the great spiritual plane. So that is the second Hermetic law, the Hermetic principle, the principle of correspondence. So again, all is mind.
And everything corresponds. Everything is affected by everything else. Everything is sympathetic, to use a different word. And this leads to the third principle, which is the principle of vibration. So this expounds the idea that motion is manifest in everything in the universe, that nothing is at rest. Everything moves, vibrates, and circles. This principle explains the distinction between manifestations of matter, energy, mind, and even spirit are the result of only different vibrations. The higher a person is on the scale, the higher the rate of the vibration will be. Here, the all is said to be at an infinite level of vibration, almost to the point of being at rest. There are said to be millions upon millions of varying degrees between the highest level, the all, and the objects of the lowest vibration. Mental transmutation is described as the practical application of this principle. To change one mental state is to change vibration. One may do this by an effort of will, by means of deliberately fixing the attention upon a more desirable state. That was the third principle, the principle of vibration. So we can already see mentalism, correspondence, and vibration being very essential presuppositions that are going to color much of the New Age worldview. And I would say much of even the psychedelic worldview. This ties into my larger dissertation project in regards to psychedelic esotericism, talking about how the presupposition and the worldview of psychedelic spirituality comes out of Western esotericism, which is greatly influenced by the Hermetic tradition from that translation project in the 15th century with Marsilio Ficino. So these central principles, I think, are really useful then to looking at people's worldview, especially within the Western esoteric or the New Age or the spiritual, and seeing how, if not, they're affected by these in different ways. So the fourth principle is the principle of polarity. The principle of polarity embodies the idea that everything is dual. Everything has two poles, and everything has its opposite. As manifested things have two sides, two aspects, or two poles. Everything is and isn't at the same time. All truths are but half-truths. Every truth is half true or half false. There are two sides to everything. Opposites are identical in nature, yet different in degree. Extremes meet, and all paradoxes may be reconciled. One of the so opposites are identical in nature yet different in degree. I've heard people talk about that metaphorically as, or I guess it wouldn't be a metaphor, but another analogy is magnetism. So there's positive and negative magnets. The nature of it, the essence, is all a magnet, but they're different degrees of magnetism, one positive, one negative, something like that. So that is the fourth Hermetic principle, the principle of polarity. The fifth Hermetic principle is the principle of rhythm. The principle of rhythm expresses the idea that in everything there's manifested a measured motion, a to and from, a flow and inflow, a swing back and forward, a pendulum-like movement. There is rhythm between every pair of opposites or poles and is closely related to the principle of polarity. It can be seen that this principle enables tension from one pole to the other, not necessarily poles of extreme opposites. So everything is rhythmical. Again, this is how you would then harmonize even with at the vibratory level, right? By changing your thoughts and trying to correspond with higher vibrations, this or that. And that there's a rhythm, there's a going back and forth, there's a pendulum-like movement to history and things in themselves. The principle of cause and effects is the sixth principle of cause and effects. It explains that there is a cause for every effect and an effect for every cause. It also states that there is no such thing as chance, and chance is merely a term indicating extant causes not recognized or perceived. The principle is clarified in the chapter Causation. So, interesting there. Of course, it's all going to be rooted back into the ultimate effects of the mind of God, or the all, or the monad, the Neoplatonic monad in which they're worshiping, and that monad thinks something into existence and therefore is the beginning cause, and then it sets forth the cause and effect. And the seventh, the very last Hermetic principle, is the principle of gender. The principle of gender embodies the idea that gender is manifested in everything. The authors state that this does not relate explicitly to the commonly understood notion of sex, but rather to beget
to procreate, to generate, to create, or to produce in general. Gender manifests itself on all planes as the feminine and masculine principles. Mental gender is described as a Hermetic concept that relates to the feminine and masculine principles. It does not refer to someone's physical sex. Yada, yada, yada. The concept put forth in the Kabbalion states that gender exists on all planes of existence, physical, mental, and spiritual, and represents different aspects of different planes. Everything and everyone contains two elements or principles. The feminine principle is always in the direction of receiving impressions and has a much more varied field of operation than the masculine. The feminine conducts the work of generating new thoughts, concepts, and ideas, including the work of imagination. The masculine principle is always in the direction of giving out or expressing and contents itself with the will in its varied phases. So that then highlights the 7 Hermetic principles, and that encapsulates what I was going to share with you guys today, and I got done just before 2 hours. That was the goal. So I feel like I pretty much covered quite a bit here. We talked about intro into Hermeticism, what it is. We talked about its history, how it's tied to the Greek god Hermes, how it's tied to the Greek god Mercury, how it's tied to the Egyptian god Thoth. Then we talked about its belief systems. We talked about the Hermetic Corpus. We talked about the reputation and its revival in the Renaissance and how it really altered the 16th century. And then we talked about the 7 Hermetic principles. So that is going to wrap up my my video today. Please, everyone, give a thumbs up, smash that like, and if you guys can, anybody who's watching who enjoys the sort of content and work that I'm doing on this YouTube channel, if you could go to my website, davidpatrickharry.com or churchoftheeternallogos.com, and potentially set something up for the amount of a coffee each month, just $5 a month. If you're feeling generous, maybe $10. I would greatly appreciate it. Anybody who signs up and does a monthly recurring payment for $5 or more will automatically get a website membership when those become available and when there's actually enough people to make it worthwhile for me to create content specific to website members. So right now we don't have enough people signed up, but if more people were to sign up, I certainly would do that. So if you guys are able, if you are appreciating what I want to do and you're feeling generous, please go to my website, davidpatrickharry.com, churchoftheeternallogos.com, and potentially make a reoccurring donation there. I'd greatly appreciate it. I'm not seeing any more questions. Let me go check the D Live chat. So, 4 people are over here at D Live. Looks good. I am going to now get off here. Again, thank you everyone for joining. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you know anybody who'd be interested in this content, please share it with them. And again, as always, until next time, God bless.